I would speak to you in the name of the true and living God. Jesus answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Not long ago, our younger daughter got very interested in the musical The Outsiders. She's a choir kid, and so she was excited about the song and dance bit, but I remember The Outsiders as one of the early Brat Pack movies from the 1980s. The story follows a group of teens and young adults from the wrong side of the tracks, known as the Greasers. The central conflict between the Greasers and the upper-class bullies is from the other side of town, known as the Socias, sort of drives the movie forward. There's a side bit, a Romeo and Juliet story between a rich girl and a poor boy. There's also a pretty profound window into the lopsided injustice that the poor receive, and a bit of tragic redemption at the end. If you haven't seen it, you should go back and watch it. The people you now know as being old and established stars were young then. But at its core, the story really revolves around this war between these two tribal factions. People trapped in their identities as a result of having different incomes, different social privileges, a different outlook on life. As we watch the movie from the outside, we want better, not only for the Greasers who we're rooting for, but also for the Socias. From the outside, we can see the unnecessary pain as the underdogs huddle together in an us versus them bunker mentality, while their wealthy bullies use the position of power and prestige to guard their turf. At the end of the day, the movie reminds us, perhaps uncomfortably, that most people would really rather be with people who are like them. This natural and all too human desire, I think, is also reflected in today's reading from both Romans and Matthew. For several weeks, I've sort of been ignoring Romans in my sermon because Romans 9 through 11, which we've been hearing, is one of the most dense and complicated theological wranglings from the Apostle Paul. He's struggling at root with questions about who are the people of God. Are they all of Abraham's biological children? Are they just Isaac's descendants? Are they all of Isaac's descendants biologically, or just those descendants of Isaac who recognize Jesus as the Messiah? Now, I won't try to summarize the entire argument because Paul can be tedious and a little bit philosophical. But at the very beginning of this argument, he tips his hand a little bit emotionally. And this emotional outburst from someone as cerebral as Paul is worth listening to. He begins this whole thing by saying that he, quote, wishes he were cut off from Christ for the sake of his own people, that my kindred according to the flesh. Now, for someone wishing to be cut off for Christ, after saying just a few books over in Corinthians that he was determined to only preach Christ and preach him crucified, Paul's concern about his fellow Jews is worth noticing. It reflected at its heart a growing reality that although Jesus was Jewish, and Paul was Jewish, and the 12 disciples were Jewish, and Mary and Martha and Lazarus and Mary Magdalene, and pretty much everyone of any note whatsoever in the Gospels is Jewish, an increasing percentage of the community of Jesus followers were not Jewish. Now, this demographic shift was in large part due to Paul's own success as a missionary. And it reflected a growing social and cultural division between Jewish people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah and Jewish people who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, Paul is not the sort of person who does things by halves. As you know, before he believed in Jesus, he was a persecutor of the people who followed Jesus. And after Paul was converted, he found it very difficult to believe that anyone who used to believe the things that he believed but doesn't believe anymore could still believe those things. He had seen the light. And why hadn't everyone else? He was troubled by the fact that his own people were increasingly a rival faction or tribe. There's a bit of this cultural prejudice that I think is also reflected in today's gospel, which is frankly one of the least loved passages from all of the New Testament. In this story, we hear how a clear outsider, a Canaanite woman from the region of Tyre and Sidon, comes to Jesus looking for help. Now, she's clearly in distress because she's been following Jesus and the disciples around for some unnamed amount of time, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David, my daughter is tormented by a demon." When Jesus does nothing about this, the disciples begin to get a little uncomfortable with her hanging around, and they suggest that Jesus should send her down the road. But Jesus does something interesting here. He doesn't say yes or no. He tells the disciples that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. When the woman runs ahead and kneels down in front of Jesus, he tells her that it's not fair to take the children's food and give it to the dogs, and she replies that even the dogs pick up the crumbs under the table. And then Jesus says, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." On its own, this passage can easily give the impression that Jesus, like his disciples, is a bit clannish, and he only comes around to blessing the woman and healing her daughter through his own reluctant journey of racial reconciliation that's actually playing out in real time before us. If we back up, though, and look at the bigger picture of the Gospel of Matthew, it seems that Jesus may have been treating this as something of a teachable moment for the disciples. You see, if you go back to the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, it starts off rather dull. In the old King James Bible, it begins, "Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah and his brothers," and so on through all the begats. This doesn't make for very interesting reading until you get down a little ways and you ask yourself, among all of these begattings, how does a woman, Ruth, suddenly turn up in this list of patriarchs? Well, Ruth is the grandmother of the great King David. That would explain something, maybe, but what's more interesting is that Ruth is not an Israelite. She is a Moabite woman. Well, flip a few pages over, and soon after Jesus' birth, Matthew tells us that wise men from the east came to Jerusalem to worship the infant Jesus. Make no mistake, these people were not from the east side of Jerusalem. They were from the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula. They were from a long ways away, and they had nothing to do with Israel. Later, Jesus heals a Roman centurion's servant. About this centurion, Jesus says an interesting thing. He tells his disciples, "In no one in Israel have I found such faith. Many will come from west and east and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." Throughout Matthew's gospel, there is this consistent theme of God's invitation always slipping across the border and inviting people in who the folks on the inside may not have been quite ready to allow in. People from outside the cultural boundaries of Israel are always being woven into this community of God's people. So when Jesus says that he was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, it sounds to the disciples like he's looking for genetic descendants of Abraham. But Jesus has a bigger vision. For him, the boundaries seem to be expanding. Like Ruth, like the Magi, like the centurion, this woman is another person who has been drawn to the message of God's love and his mercy made flesh in Jesus. The lost sheep that Jesus was sent to find may simply be people of whatever tribe or nation happen to be looking for God. Jesus was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and standing right in front of the disciples, this Canaanite woman was declared a lost sheep. So what do we do with a story like this? Well, having gotten my brain stuck in Brat Pack movies, I would suggest that our job as a community of Jesus is to be a little bit less like the disciples or like Paul or the outsiders, and instead turn our hearts and minds back to one of my old favorites, The Breakfast Club. As you know, the movie chronicles a Saturday detention undertaken by the most mismatched group of students to ever walk the earth. There's a rebel, there's a socialite, there's a jock, a basket case, and a nerd, and they're all thrown together with this obnoxious assistant principal. They quarrel and make fun of each other, and at some point, the rebel, who is frankly the least likable member of the group, opens up a little bit about his troubles. Others soon follow, and they discover something of their shared humanity. More importantly, though, they begin to see that the differences which they use to carve people up and put them in little groups with labels attached are actually not best used that way. Differences become the foundation of a bigger community. The rebel who hated everyone saves everyone through his own selfless act of running down the hall to distract the principal so they didn't all get detention again. The socialite takes the basket case with messy hair and all kinds of weird things going on and gives her a little makeover so that she can see herself in a new way. The nerd uses his academic skills to write the essay that gets them all out of detention at the end of the day. They go their separate ways, not as people who are defined by labels that others have given them, or maybe they've given themselves, but by people who care for one another in a way that redefines who they are. In this light, it appears that one of the essential jobs we have as Christians is to move beyond the easy and quiet and unspoken tribalism of ordinary human life. In Romans, Paul reminds us that the righteous will live by faith. Matthew is forever weaving in these outsiders into the story of salvation. And Isaiah declares that God's house will be a house of prayer for all people. If we want to be that kind of community, the kind of community that the disciples didn't really understand, the kind of community that was perplexing even to someone as bright as Paul, if we want to be a house of prayer for all people, then we need to be the kind of people who are always ready to welcome the next stranger. We need to be the kind of people who look past our labels, the ones we put on ourselves and the ones we put on others, and understand that the greatest thing we all share is the need for God's love, and that God is always looking for the next lost sheep. Jesus answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.